Hey everyone, I just played Tormented Souls, and it was nice. Developed by Dual Effect, it's a retro survival horror game in which you must escape a haunted hospital. And you already know this. Tormented Souls is famous, it's award-winning, there are a ton of videos about it. It's even got a sequel, which is actually what got me interested in returning to the game in the first place. Since its release in 2021, it's become one of the best known examples of the retro survival horror boom. So, naturally, I don't like it. Well, no, that's not exactly true, but it wouldn't be out of character. I've reviewed a bunch of retro survival horror games for the channel over the years, and every single one of them, whether I enjoyed the experience or not, has just been missing something. Tormented Souls is no different. It's why I dropped the game when I first tried to play it back at release, way before I even started making videos. And also, why I want to discuss it now. So, let's talk about it. But before I get my hands into the guts of what Tormented Souls gets wrong about the retro survival horror formula, I should go through what it gets right, which is nearly everything. The game's reputation is well deserved, it nails the early PS2 era survival horror style, and you can feel the love Dual Effect have for the classics everywhere you go. Tormented Souls tells the story of Carolyn Walker, who one fine day in 1994 receives a mysterious letter containing a photograph of twin girls she believes to be in danger. Following the return address brings her to the long-abandoned Wildberger Hospital, which sounds like it should be the flagship location in a fast food chain, but is actually a condemned building full of nightmares just waiting to be let out. Anyway, Carolyn gets abducted the moment she steps inside, and when she awakes, she's lying naked in a bathtub with a tube shoved down her throat. But once you climb out, you make an even more startling discovery. Whoever knocked Carolyn out also took her eye, and that's not even the worst part. Night has transformed the hospital into a maze of locked doors and broken floors where the darkness itself can swallow you whole if you're not careful. Things stay pretty quiet until you wind your way down to the basement and have your first encounter with a monster, and also this thing in a wheelchair. After that, the plot settles into the background, and you're left to face the horrors of Wildberger Hospital alone. But what beautiful horrors they are! Tormented Souls was one of the first fixed camera retro survival horror games I became aware of, and even several years later it's still one of the best looking. Wildberger Hospital is a gothic haunted house in all the best ways, from the clutter to the statues to the paintings to the gore. It helps that Tormented Souls has fantastic lighting which really makes the shadows pop. The darkness will devour you if you step out of the light, which turns some combat encounters into puzzles. Sometimes you'll need to search around for a candle to burn so you can equip your weapons, or a switch to flip to turn the ceiling lights on, and that gloom does a lot to get the heart racing, as well as accentuate the hospital's strange geometries. The fixed camera angles never let you get close enough to get a proper sense of what you're looking at unless it's a puzzle or a painting. The game wants you leaning in close to the screen to squint at what might be hiding just beyond the flame of Carolyn's lighter. There's a good mix of static angles and flowing tilts meant to create a sense of unease, and it usually works really well. The sewers underneath the hospital are a little too dark and a little too bland for my liking, though there were still moments when they creeped me out. There was even one late game room that I won't spoil, which transcended a nice video game environment to become something more akin to an art installation. I could have spent hours looking over every inch of that place. Still, a lot of it does devolve into overly dark, overly bland corridors by the final act. Tormented Souls sometimes struggles with telegraphing interactive elements of an environment too. Notes and diaries take the form of open books, but not all open books are notes or diaries. Can you tell which of the open books on screen right now is the collectible one? That's right, it's none of them. I've been bamboozled! At other times, the game does a really poor job of telegraphing puzzle elements. This blinking light on the wall of the maternity ward is a secret switch to open the hatch on the other side of the room, and while one of the maintenance logs draws attention to it, none of the camera angles do. Their focus remains on the other, much more obvious puzzle right next to it, which isn't a problem if you pay attention to the maintenance log, but then take this rusty shit heap of a door on the other side of the hatch. Even once I found the hammer you need to politely suggest the handle start moving again, the solution didn't work because there are a bunch of other interactive elements to this door that do not draw the eye at all, but must be dealt with before you can force the stupid thing open. And then, of course, there's the other world. It wouldn't be an homage to Silent Hill without it, though in Tormented Souls it's a place you can visit at will rather than a hell you're thrown into as the plot demands. And it's appropriately rusty, the sort of place that requires a tetanus booster to even look at, with some fun contrasts between the two dimensions, like how physical bodies in the real world are rendered as dolls in the other world, which leads to a few interesting set-piece puzzles. But on the whole, I think the rusty hellscape is a bit played out at this point. It's not an aspect of Silent Hill's mythology I've ever found particularly compelling anyway, but at least in those games it makes sense as an element of horror. Silent Hill's environments tend toward naturalistic, formally lived-in spaces. That's what makes their transformation into the logic-bereft nightmare of the other world scary in the first place. But Wildburger Hospital is already a gothic horror puzzle box running on insane Resident Evil logic. There's very little another world can actually do to make that scarier, and while I enjoyed the puzzles built around its existence, I mostly found its presence here pretty bland, and given it disappears entirely toward the end of the game, I think Tormented Souls might have been better off without it at all. There's something very similar to it with a lot more narrative impact that could have had the other world's better aspects folded into it, though that too is not without its problems. And oh boy, do I have a lot to say about that shit. Even if the later game areas weren't always as visually interesting as the hospital, there's an undercurrent of surgery as ritual everywhere you go in Tormented Souls, which is a comparison I've never really considered before, but makes perfect sense once you start thinking about it. It's a theme carried through the enemies as well, small though the roster is. They're all sickly or injured in one way or another that brings to mind the monsters seen in Jacob's Ladder, a movie that, coincidentally, also had a huge influence on the Silent Hill games, though sometimes it feels as though Tormented Souls skipped right past inspired by to land squarely on taken directly from, like with the most common enemy you'll encounter. They're just the legless thing from Jacob's Ladder with even less muscle. It's very on the nose compared to how well Tormented Souls generally blends its other influences. A lot of the enemies you encounter across Wildburger Hospital are missing legs actually, which I'm sure made the process of animating them a lot easier, and also ties pretty well into the medical horror side of the game's atmosphere. The religious horror side of the coin is represented by the environments, which have a very Latin American Catholic vibe to them with the abundance of crosses and beautifully arranged bodies, though ironically, Carolyn and the priest are way more unsettling. The stylistic abstraction of the enemies doesn't hold a candle to the uncanny valley mannequin monster that serves as Tormented Souls heroine. Most of the model is fine, but the second you get a good look at Carolyn's face, it becomes clear something's off. It's such a subtle issue that I can't even put a finger on what it is that gets my hackles up, but it does, and the same is true of the priest. Part of it, I think, is that they don't open their mouths when they speak. Carolyn can emote, but often doesn't during cutscenes, which would be fine in a low-poly game aiming for that PS1 look like Alyssa, but is harder to ignore in a title aiming for high visual fidelity. There's another NPC who I won't spoil on screen yet, for your own protection obviously, who falls even further into the uncanny valley. But at least Carolyn's boobs look great, right? Really put the effort to make those 5 seconds of bare nipple really shine. Not that I actually have a problem with it, nudity has its place in horror. It's just weird that it comes right after Carolyn gets whacked on the back of the head, which might be the most violent moment in the game despite the lack of gore, because there's none of the classic survival horror camp that can otherwise be seen everywhere in Tormented Souls visual design. That's the funny thing. As campy as Carolyn's outfits can be, and for how aggressive the jiggle physics are, goddamn, the few moments where she shows up completely nude are only ever played for horror. Which again, would be fine if the rest of the visual design matched that tone, but often it doesn't, which creates a disconnect I don't think the game ever quite reconciles. Tormented Souls has a very serious tone overall, more so even than the Resident Evils and Silent Hills which inspired it, given there's no secret joke ending where she gets abducted by aliens, or a separate arcade mode with a wardrobe of outlandish costumes to equip, which makes its own journeys into clown world nonsense stand out as more discordant by comparison. A lot of that is confined to an aspect of the game I'll save for the section on spoilers, but it does bleed out into other areas of Tormented Souls up to and including the final boss, and it definitely rears its head in the jank. Carolyn's skirt has a habit of freaking out, sometimes footsteps don't play. The word youngling is unironically used in one of the notes, and then there's the voice acting.
Ah, we meet again.
Father? What are you doing here?
Don't you see, child? I am eating some soup. God feeds my spirit, but I have to take care of my body. Oh my, what is this doing in my soup? Get rid of this thing, would you?
I found some information about the twins. I think someone means to perform surgery on them.
I see. There is an operating room on the West Wing. Who would do such a thing?
I don't know, but I'm going to find out.
I can't tell if this was a stylistic decision made by the director or a result of the voice cast recording their lines separately, or just bad performances, but I really don't like it. Every time one of the characters opened their mouth, or to be more accurate, didn't, it just shattered the atmosphere for me. What's interesting is I don't think it would have if the presentation was aiming for the PS1 era rather than the PS2, and what bugs me is that no other aspect of the audio design is like this. The enemies make some awful sounds that alert you to their presence long before they appear on screen. The environments have a lot of nice ambience. The weapons bang and hiss the way they should. I could listen to the puzzle elements for hours. And the music, while pretty generic, fits the mood. I actually put in my notes that the music reminds me of Dino Break, but I think that's a bit unfair. Tormented Souls deserves better. It's certainly scarier than Dino Break, though that's a low bar to clear. It's buried 6 feet underground. That said, Tormented Souls was only ever scary when it wasn't trying to be. Plucking up the nerve to venture deeper into the darkness of the basement 30 minutes out from my last save with no exit and no light source in sight, surrounded by weird fucked up noises, was a great moment of emergent horror, one that ebbed and flowed even around the catharsis of this jump scare early on. But when the camera angle got into position for this obvious scare in the morgue, I just rolled my eyes and marched on in, like, yeah, come on, let's get this over with. Yep. There it is. I was surprised at how well Tormented Souls kept the tension high throughout, actually. Normally in survival horror games, the scares fade as the game goes on, and I become familiar with both the enemies and the environments. But while that usual desensitization did still happen, the tension remained taut right up to the final boss fight due to Tormented Souls' razor-sharp balancing. I felt like I was on the verge of running out of health and ammunition all the way through the game, from the very start to the very end. Every time I did stumble across a new weapon or a top-up of supplies, it was only enough to get me through the next couple of rooms, and then I'd be back to wondering how I was going to deal with the next monster that jumped out at me. I never completely ran out of ammunition, but I never felt like I had a comfortable pile of bullets to fall back on either. For a while, I thought I'd completely fucked myself early on by fighting this boss with the nail gun, since it soaked up so many clips compared to the 2 or 3 shotgun shells it would have taken to kill instead. It forced me to pick and choose which enemies to down and which to leave for the sake of preserving ammunition. Was it worth killing the ones in out-of-the-way places I was only likely to visit once or twice? Could I rely on my skills with the tank controls to get me out of a bind if I left enemies in major thoroughfares with lots of space alive? Was it worth going back to explore a dead end guarded by an enemy in an out-of-the-way corner of the map? I can't remember the last time I had to take things so tactically in a retro survival horror game. Usually I end up sitting on a mountain of supplies no amount of enemies can ever hope to summit, but Tormented Souls kept them genuinely threatening throughout by using item scarcity to its advantage. It was only at the very end that I found myself gaining the upper hand with a few pre-boss fight goodie bags, and even then I had to stack the odds in my favour to come out on top. I had to line up enemies to catch 2 or 3 of them with a single shotgun blast. At earlier points I can actually show you, I had to lure them into the sights of these suits of armour in order to save ammo, or rely on the dodge mechanic to preserve Carolyn's health. It was a very rewarding experience, but it could also be a very frustrating one. It's still a bit too abrasive for the game's own good, like how you can take damage instantly on entering a room if an enemy happens to spawn right beside the door. Enemies can spit at you through walls as well, which is just crap, but probably the biggest issue I have with the combat isn't jank at all, but the size and speed of the starting enemies. The thing in the wheelchair you encounter down in the basement is a decent starting enemy, but these guys you encounter throughout the game have the strength and speed of adversaries you'd normally only see show up halfway through a classic survival horror title. Dino Crisis also pulled this trick, and I praised that game for it, but the raptors are like 4 times the size of these guys, and you're generally given a lot more room to maneuver around them too. The halls and corridors of Wildburger are illegally narrow for a hospital, which makes pirouetting around the enemies impossible, and while Carolyn does have a dodge, it's only good against melee attacks. If an enemy starts coughing up a hairball, there's nothing a short hop backward can do to avoid it. You're just eating that damage, and there's no way to tell which attack you'll get until after you've already hit the button. And while the other enemies present a much bigger, much slower target, they're no easier to avoid when they get up close. That razor-sharp balance is the whole reason I ended up dropping the game back in 2021 and restarting the game to record it in 2025. You have just enough health and ammo to get by, but if you lose the rhythm of combat and waste too many nails, or let the damage pile up, you'll be left without the supplies necessary to continue once you hit the mid-game. This happened to me a lot with the original Resident Evils and Dino Crises when I was a kid. I'd get a couple of hours in, use up too much health and ammo to continue, and be forced to restart. But it's rare that an indie game has recreated that experience. The only other example I can think of is Alyssa, 2021's other retro survival horror indie darling. But while Alyssa has a whole melee combat system to fall back on if you do run low on ammo, Tormented Souls doesn't have any such safety net. Past a certain point, the only way to dig yourself out of that hole is to restart. And in 2021, with a bad case of the pandemic blues, I didn't have the patience for that. The game wasn't really clicking for me at the time anyway, for a number of reasons. It didn't seem to know what sort of horror it was going for, the story seemed like an afterthought, which is always a turn-off for me, every enemy seemed to bully me up and down the hospital, but probably worst of all was I just couldn't tell where to go next, which in hindsight seems to have also been a product of the pandemic blues, because Tormented Souls goes out of its way to point you in the right direction, but you do need to know how to properly ask it for help. The priest you meet in the basement pops up every so often to tell you where to go next. The maintenance logs usually explain how you're meant to solve certain puzzles, and the map is covered with icons letting you know where certain interactive puzzle elements are located. But now having completed Tormented Souls, I do think the game could have done a better job of explaining what it wants once you do actually wander around to where you're meant to go. Sometimes it's very well done, like the boss fight in the operating room. You see this guy pacing around the body carrying a candelabra in the dark from the observation room, so when you return to the theatre you kill the lights, take out the lighter, and start walking in circles until the boss wakes up for the fight. That's a great intuitive game design, to the point that even after forgetting pretty much everything else about Tormented Souls in the 4 years between my original attempt and finally finishing it for this video, I still remembered this guy pacing around the operating table. It's that good. But then there are puzzles where even having the hint on what you're meant to do doesn't fully explain how you're meant to solve them. Sometimes that comes down to not knowing there's an extra element to the puzzle you haven't found yet, like with the fucking rusty door I mentioned earlier, or this floppy that you cannot copy until you flip the fucking pixel-sized switch on the back, which is not the same as unlocking the top thing, which you also need to do in order to complete the puzzle, or the bit with the vending machine that I can't go into detail on because of spoilers. And other times it felt like the game contradicted its own rules, like with the cash register puzzle. I did eventually crack the code to get it open, but either I mistranslated the cipher or the game lied about how to decode it, because the hint as I understood it did not match the deciphered answer. Combine that with how often the game sometimes fails to use blocking or lighting or sound to draw attention to important aspects of the environment, and it just feels like Tormented Souls takes great delight in ripping away the football right as you're going in to punt it over the goal. Like it's going, oh, you've figured out my puzzle? Well, you forgot to take into account this thing I never even told you about, and you had no way of knowing. Egg on your face. Aren't you feeling silly? It comes off as so smug, so pleased with itself, and I don't think that was intentional on the part of the developers, but it certainly grated every time I ran into it. Like, nothing is allowed to be straightforward. Everything had to have a mechanical twist. Even the first major puzzle in the game, where you turn on the generator in the basement, requires you to set the pressure gauge to 11 rather than the necessary 10, because the needle drops by 1 when you hit the button to initiate the startup. Not every puzzle was like this. Just as many flowed as intuitively as the ritual in the operating theatre, and sometimes they even made logical sense. The code to the padlock in the opening room being the twins' birth date makes sense given their mother started using it as her PIN number for everything. Using a bolt as a makeshift fuse just feels like a good recipe for a fire, and I don't mind mind having to inspect items on principle either, that was a lot of fun. I generally loved the puzzle screens throughout Tormented Souls, but I've never seen a survival horror game be so pedantic about item interactions either. There's one point in the late game where you have to repeatedly open and close the lid on this gas canister to both fill it up and pour the contents out into a generator. It's just so weird. It's like the game had two design leads, and one wanted to make Myst, while the other wanted to make a survival horror game. How does this hallway of warnings before a really big, really good, really convoluted, yet really intuitive set-piece puzzle make it in, when the game also has this bit where it crosses its arms, puts on a smug expression and goes, "I don't know, you figure it out." Combine the combative puzzles with the very narrow margins for error you get in the actual combat, and yeah, I'm starting to understand why I ran out of patience with Tormented Souls back in the day. And I didn't even get to the really egregious shit, but probably the biggest reason I dropped it was the story. The writing is really what prompted me to make this video, because it is the thing that I feel falls just short of making the game a modern classic. Most of it is relayed to the player through notes, and usually I find the collectibles in indie survival horror games to be pretty disposable, but the ones in Tormented Souls do add a lot to the experience. I've already spoken about the maintenance logs, but there are diaries you can find from all the background characters that do eventually shed light on what's going on. At the beginning of the game, it comes off as your standard ominous garbage that goes in one eye and... But I was wrong. They do carry weight, and without the foundation the early entries build, the late game reveals wouldn't land quite so well. It just takes a long time to come together. At its core, Tormented Souls is a story about a generational trauma wrapped up snug in both religious and medical overtones that again comes off as uniquely Latin American, even when you can draw direct parallels to other survival horror stories like Silent Hill. The island that Wildberger Hospital was built upon has a long history of human sacrifice that has survived European colonization into the present day. And hey, the ritual just happens to have an appetite for twins. Maria Wildberger wants to break the cycle of familial trauma with her twins, while William Wildberger wants to live up to the expectations of the previous generation, at least at first, and the two simply aren't compatible. It's a point of contention that cracks open their marriage and leaves both them and their twin daughters Anna and Emma in danger of succumbing to the whims of the older generation in a very believable way that climaxes in a big escape that ends in tragedy. Everyone has their own motivations and complexities, like Noah, Maria's father, who loves his granddaughters, but is more than willing to sacrifice them in the ritual after spending his whole life resentful of the fact his own twin died in the womb, leaving his own perceived purpose unfulfilled. The problem is, none of that is present tense. It's all relegated to the backstory. You're just a ghost going through decades-old dirty laundry. Things do pick up toward the end, as all the pieces fall into place, and the backstory catches up to the current-day events of the plot, to the point that I was surprised at how invested I was by the final boss. But that's mostly to do with the fact the plot hides in the shadows for the first 3/4 of the game. Compare that to the classics, or even other retro indie throwbacks, where plot is usually front and center from start to finish. I get it though, modeling and rigging and animating NPCs is hard, and voice actors are expensive. It's incredible that Tormented Souls turned out as well as it did, but the pacing suffers for it. The reveals already hit pretty hard if you've been paying attention, but I can't help but imagine how much harder they'd land if you actually got to meet the people mentioned throughout the notes, to actually know them, rather than simply know of them. Even the present events of the plot get rendered into backstory whenever you save, because Carolyn will record her thoughts for posterity on tape, which is fun, but I think it might have worked better upon loading instead. That way you'd get a little recap of what you've done and what you're doing before jumping back into things, instead of stopping the game dead in its tracks for Carolyn to dictate her thoughts. It's not a constant thing. You usually only get them after a hefty bit of progression, and you can skip them if you don't don't care, so it's not like the game sits you down and forces you to listen, it's just a fun little thing that calls back to the save systems of the classics. But, believe it or not, all of that is secondary to what I actually want to talk about when it comes to Tormented Souls plot, and I'm going to have to get into spoilers to do it, so if you want to experience the game yourself, go to here. Tormented Souls doesn't just take place across multiple dimensions, it takes place across multiple time periods too. Occasionally you'll pick up an old VHS tape and slotting it into the player on the upper floor of the hospital will open up a portal to the past, along with a whole can of narrative worms, because the second you introduce the concept of time travel into a story it becomes a countdown to Clown World, and boy does Tormented Souls not waste time putting on a big red nose. Ironically, the time travel component is critical to what I think is the best story beat in the game, but it requires a bit of setup to explain. Carolyn being one of the twins seen in the inciting photograph is pretty obvious, but its real value in the plot is as a distraction to the real twists. The first being that Carolyn's twin sister has become this bloated corpse of a Michelin Man monster who pursues you throughout the second half of the game. She's sort of a Mr. X Pyramid Head kind of figure, and she's creepy enough when she first shows up. She's got her own musical sting, and she's a welcome shake-up to the early game areas now devoid of enemies. But she's also very easy to avoid, because all you need to do to escape her is leave the room. Anyway, it's hard to see given how distant she usually is from the camera, but her eyes have been gouged out. You later learn she clawed them out herself, and for a very good reason. In the sewers underneath Wildberger Hospital lies the entrance to a vault locked behind 2 retinal scanners that can only be bypassed by a pair of twins. At that point in the story, Carolyn doesn't know she's one of the twins in the photo, or that the monster chasing her around the hospital is her sister. She still believes the children she's searching for are inside the vault, and that they're in danger, which leads to Carolyn going back in time to a few hours before the start of the game to pluck out her own eye so she can use it to unlock the vault and continue searching for the twins in the present. I love this twist so much. The whole game I was thinking back to those opening moments when Carolyn first awoke and discovered someone had taken her eye. The whole game I was wondering when I'd find a note explaining why the villain would need it. I never once thought Carolyn would end up being the one to have done it to herself. It genuinely got me. I was really impressed. Making it part of a puzzle was just the icing on the cake. It's a brilliant moment until you start thinking about it. One of the reasons I didn't see the twist coming is that it contradicts the established rules of time travel in this setting. The other 2 times you travel back to the past to play the shitty games that suck, they're also part of puzzles. You find a locked cell door in the present, but the acid you've got on you will take too long to dissolve the padlock, go back in time, slather that thing in the forbidden vinegar, return to the present, and there you go. It's melted to nothing. What's important here is that you have to go back in the first place to make the change. The timeline isn't set in stone. You don't stumble onto the padlock already broken because in chronological terms Carolyn already sourced it up. You're stumbling across a problem, then going back to the past to create a new timeline where that problem doesn't exist. It's like another game I covered, Decade, only instead of changing the fate of humanity, you're trying to open a door. And it's another fun puzzle, but it's also a completely different style of time travel. Usually works about time travel adhere to the idea that everything is already predetermined and nothing can be changed, like in Terminator 1, or time is malleable, anything goes bullshit, like Terminator 2, but I've never encountered an individual work that subscribes to both at once. Carolyn waking up with the eye already missing should mean the padlock is already broken, but it isn't, and having to travel back to 1980 to destroy the padlock should mean Carolyn starts the game with both eyes intact, but she doesn't. There are other little moments like this that just pile on the temporal complications too. The first time you meet the priest, he acts as though Carolyn and he have spoken before, and they have, in the past, next to the vending machine from hell. But in that very same flashback, set a couple of days before the start of the game, you have to leave a battery to recharge, charge because you don't have time to wait for it in the present. So the flashback's already happened because the priest mentions it happening, but it also hasn't already happened because the battery isn't in the charging station waiting for you the second you find it, and... Ah, Clown World, my beloved. And it only gets worse the deeper you delve. The reason Anna is absent from the first half of the game is because she only becomes Mr. Blobby after she spends 14 years living underneath the hospital after Carolyn frees her from this cell in 1980. In the original timeline, you find her bones still trapped inside, but you also find evidence of someone living underneath the hospital before making that temporal change. And while I guess it could be William, why would he choose to sleep in the boiler room when he owns the hospital and, you know, has his own fucking bedroom on the second floor? I guess it could also be Noah, Billy's father-in-law and Carolyn's grandfather, but again, I don't know why he'd choose to live in the hospital like a rat when he has a life outside its walls. Even then, Anna's monster form makes an appearance in this mirror that leads to the hospital's otherworld before you time travel her into existence, so who knows what the fuck is going on. More frustrating to me is that the time travel is never given an explanation, nor is the otherworld for that matter, but the monsters are, and I guess you could use the latter explanation for the former too. The Egg of God down at the very bottom of the island is mutating members of the cult at the heart of the conflict into weird monsters, so maybe the otherworld is just a glimpse into its nightmares, and Carolyn is the only one who can venture inside them because of her special twin blood or whatever. But the time travel doesn't really fit into that explanation. In fairness, it doesn't need a concrete answer, but it's weird that the game never offers so much as a vague interpretation for it either. Like, at least Silent Hill drops enough breadcrumbs to build a semblance of an explanation for its own supernatural elements beyond the town just being like that. The Clown World honking gets even harder to ignore when it comes to the endings. But first, another twist. The priest is actually evil. Yeah, obviously. You're telling me the only living NPC you meet in the whole game, the guy who tells you exactly where to go whenever you get stuck, the man who also seems to get behind every locked door before Carolyn can even find the key, the dude drowned in religious imagery when the most evil bastard in a backstory full of evil bastards is the most zealous of the cultists, is actually the bad guy? Who could have seen this coming? What's a little more surprising is that it isn't him who brains Carolyn at the start of the game. That was actually William, who didn't even realise Carolyn was his own daughter, and never does because Noah then kills him in order to bring the ritual to fruition. When Carolyn finally confronts him at the bottom of the vault, he's already captured Anna, but his attempts to birth his god don't exactly go to plan.
It's over, Noah. How many girls were sacrificed for that thing? Those bastards won't hurt anyone ever again.
You know, if you squint, it almost looks like a clown wig, and after that, you're left with 3 endings. The bad ending is the easiest to get, since all it requires is you to ignore Anna strung up on the cross before going to confront Noah. But it's actually the ending players have seen the least, according to Steam achievements anyway. The hospital is no longer as haunted, and the sun has finally risen on this night of terror, but the ghosts haven't fled the light. Carolyn tries to leave, but Anna stops her dead. The end. It's short and pretty unsatisfying, so, you know, appropriate for the bad ending. The neutral ending requires administering this cure to Anna while she's incapacitated. This is William's life's work, a final and unintended gift to his daughters that is elaborated upon a bit more in the notes. It cures Anna, but only for a few moments. She passes on, Carolyn kills God, and thus this time no one is left to stop her leaving once she reaches the main hall. The end. But we can do one better. We can go full Clown World. If you cure Anna and take the bolt cutters from the cross, then after Carolyn kills God, you can take a detour into the past on your way back up each layer of the hospital to free Anna from her cell in 1980. Carolyn then brings her into the present, and they escape together, reunited at last. Now, Okay, so Anna is now alive in the present, but only because Carolyn saved her from the past. So there's now a 14-year age gap between these identical twin sisters. And you know what? That's honestly an interesting plot development. You could do a lot with that. So it's no surprise that is the ending the sequel chooses to follow. However, what about the rest of the fucking game? If Anna never becomes Mr. Blobby, then did Noah never have his arm ripped off? Is he even dead? Is William? Has the conflict even been resolved in this new timeline? This is only a good ending if you don't stop to think about it for more than a second, and it certainly doesn't line up with some of the game's other uses of time travel. Carolyn's reunited with Anna, yeah, but the latter's now stuck in an unfamiliar time period, and the former is suddenly going to have to step up as a parental figure to someone who might as well be a complete stranger. And I can already tell the sequel's never going to comment on any of that. It's so messy, and not even in an intentionally obtuse way some time travel stories can be. It's Clown World in a very direct way, but yeah, whatever, the end. The funniest part about all this is I meant what I said about the backstory told through the notes. It is effective and well told, and actually matters to the present tense of the plot, when usually so many logs in survival horror games are worthless beyond offering puzzle hints. But it's not what any of the endings choose to focus on. Instead, it's just Clown World all the way down. But I think it's also indicative of the underlying issue that prevents Tormented Souls from being the perfect throwback to the classics I've been looking for. Ultimately, Tormented Souls can't decide what it's trying to be. There are elements of Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Haunting Ground, Fatal Frame, and probably other horror classics here that simply don't cohere the way I think Dual Effect wanted them to. The Resident Evil puzzle box environment doesn't lend itself well to Silent Hill-style psychological horror. The acute difficulty curve in the combat worked well for Dino Crisis with its massive enemies and big open spaces, but grates with a roster of slippery little bastards in the Wildberger Hospital's cramped rooms. And when it comes to the puzzles, it feels like the devs mistook complicated and pedantic for challenging and satisfying. I did end up enjoying Tormented Souls more than I expected I would from the memories of that abandoned run back in 2021, but it has a diabolical early game hell that required multiple restarts to escape. I think it's telling that if you look at the Steam achievements, there is a massive drop-off of players after the first couple of story beats, no doubt thanks to the game's insane difficulty, which I think is a real shame because it's only in the back half that Tormented Souls really comes into its own. For so many years I've wondered why this got all the attention while Alyssa didn't, and now I get it. I think ultimately I still prefer Alyssa, it's just more my vibe, but Tormented Souls is still another great example of retro indie survival horror. There are parts of it I think are a little too silly or abrasive, parts of it I really didn't like, but yeah, that was good. I'm glad I gave it another chance. And it's got me wondering, if this is what Dual Effect could put together on a tight budget, imagine what they're capable of in a sequel with some actual money behind it. Thanks for watching. And that's the video. Before I go, I'd like to thank by name the people supporting me with $5 US a month or more on Patreon. Anonymous, Abril, Azazel, Cass, Hawkwing2652, Heymatey, Heavy, Jeffiet, Jeff Ladd, Captain Ketchup, Paranoid Android, Reaper2122, Rock or Something, Babar the Elephant, Smingless, Sarah Bloomer, Smorsky, Sneezy McGlassface, Space Quest Historian, That One Turian, The Official 476, This Sauerkraut, Thomas Angel, Thomas Elliott, Tree3, Angry Bees, Ursa, and Zeke the Phantom. Thank you so much. This video and everything I make for the channel is now made possible by their generous support. I don't make money off ads and I don't take sponsors, so if you like what I do and want to see more, please consider donating. And if you can't support monthly or just don't want to give Patreon money, Ko-Fi is also an option. But if financial support isn't possible and you still want to help the channel out, please like and subscribe if you haven't already and share the video around because YouTube sure won't. Please and thank you. Links are in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.